We kick off the hours we do each week at this time with Damian Farrell. He is an architect here in Ann Arbor, award-winning architect, nationally renowned. Damian Farrell Design Group. Great to have you back with us, sir.
It's always good to be here.
Yeah. And last week's show, we were talking with Randy Case.
Yes, we were.
Who recommended today's guest.
He's at the end of the show. He said, "You guys really should talk to Emilie Evans." And boom, poof, we rub the little lamp, the genie lamp, and Emilie Evans shows up in the studio this morning.
This is going to be very interesting, too, because she is a relatively new resident of the Detroit area. She is a preservation specialist with the Michigan Historic Preservation Network and the National Trust for Historic Preservation based in Detroit. And I have to ask you, coming from Washington, D.C., you grew up there.
I did.
In D.C. What are your impressions of Detroit, especially given the fact it's been much in the news with the bankruptcy of late?
Sure. Detroit is a phenomenal place to be. I really love being here. Or there. I guess we're in Ann Arbor today, aren't we? The drive would have told me that. So,
but isn't it funny how Ann Arbor, no one considers Ann Arbor a suburb of Detroit?
Oh, no. Yes.
Splendid.
Yet it's very close to Detroit.
Yeah. No, Detroit is a wonderful place to be. I've really enjoyed being there. My work is fascinating. I feel an excellent sense of camaraderie on the ground in Detroit. Everyone is really welcoming and excited to have new blood on the ground. And, I just have enjoyed a lot of conversations. There's so many exciting things happening there. And I'm happy to be contributing whatever I can to the city.
What is a preservation specialist?
Sure. So my job is myriad of wonderful things. I work with local community groups, helping them get connected to preservation resources, whether that's grants or support in some way for their preservation projects on the ground. And I'm also working at the citywide level, actually working on a project that is probably going to be quite interesting to you guys today, which is practically a citywide survey of 6 really large historic neighborhoods in Detroit to help inform decisions that are being made around demolition using a substantial amount of money, $52 million from the hardest hit funds. And this money is being implemented on the ground in these 6 neighborhoods. I'm happy to name them if you're interested.
Yeah, why don't you? I'd like to know.
Sure. So it's UDM Marygrove, Southwest, Jefferson Chalmers, Grandmont Rosedale, North End, and East English Village / Morningside.
Okay.
And so there's a substantial amount of money being used for demolition in these 6 neighborhoods, and what we're offering is actually a preservation perspective on some very large eligible historic districts in these neighborhoods. Parcel by parcel, we're doing a survey with about 75 plus volunteers that have come out of the woodwork in support of this project. And we're using a fantastic web-based platform called Local Data that's usable on your smartphone to collect data for questions about each property in these eligible historic districts to help inform the Detroit Land Bank Authority and the Detroit Blight Task Force, help them make better, more well-rounded decisions around strategic demolition.
Is this to make sure that historic properties, the old grand dames of Detroit that were so prevalent back in the day, that they don't disappear, that they're rehabbed instead of demoed?
Well, I wish that, there's a lack of rehab money out there, unfortunately, which is something that's a bigger problem in general, not just to preservationists, but, architects and all kinds of investors are interested in that money. But what we're trying to do is, rather than make recommendations about what should stay and what should go, help those decision makers incorporate a preservation perspective when they're making those decisions. So we're looking at things like architectural integrity of these properties, how much they're in keeping with neighborhood character, because we're trying to keep those neighborhoods intact. We're looking at the intactness of that block. Is it totally decimated? Is it really quite stable and fully intact? And then we have a little flag question in case there's a really unique property out there that warrants a little bit further research for us to look into.
In reading your blogs, you talk about strategic demolition, which is an interesting word to put in front of demolition in the Detroit context, because it is something that's been, along with the blight, that not just the blight, but also some of the decimation that's gone on in the city. Things like famous Devil's Nights and so on, and that's all that I think people think about, are these old buildings. But it sounds like there are buildings that do need that demolition, but that there are also buildings that are absolutely in a perfect position to be preserved.
That's absolutely correct. There's not an entity that I know of, and certainly not the Michigan Historic Preservation Network, that thinks that demolition is not a necessary component of sort of a right sizing or strategy for Detroit moving forward. We have an overabundance of vacant and abandoned building stock, some of which is beyond repair, even for preservationists. But that's not to say that there aren't an enormous number of buildings that are stable, that are well mothballed or in the position to be well mothballed, that can be stabilized for future investment and future development. And those are buildings, not just individual buildings, but really looking at those buildings in the context of their neighborhoods. In other words, should we, and I pose this, should we potentially prioritize, in a preservation prioritization, buildings that are on a more fully intact block, rather than the sort of isolated buildings that are kind of on their own on a block? That's a give and take, and that's something that needs to be looked at almost case by case basis. So I'm not making a sweeping past judgment, but I am saying that those things need to be considered.
There has been a lot of talk about how, in order to make Detroit stronger, you may have to take some neighborhoods or some areas and actually do away with them to make it more centralized and to bring it into maybe a denser type of Detroit. Especially the areas that there is a lot of blight in. So how do you do that if that's true? And I mean, if they're looking at areas just to do away with, how do you do that with what you're looking at here in some preservation ideas? Are you working with the city directly?
Well, we work with the city, this Historic Districts Advisory Board and the Historic Districts Commission, so we do work, and we are working, we've had wonderful meetings and talks with Detroit Future City and other entities that are working at the citywide level about creating preservation priorities. Whether or not the city politically determines that they're going to do away with one neighborhood or another, is not exactly a preservation concern, but identifying key buildings that need some support, that could be anchor buildings for a neighborhood, looking at keeping, as I mentioned, neighborhoods intact. Those are all things that we think a lot about and want to prioritize those buildings.
What kind of response are you getting from the people?
Well, a lot of really positive support, actually. There are so many people that do not want to see everything torn down. And perhaps recognize that some amount of demolition is necessary, but really don't want to lose the integrity of our neighborhoods and the integrity of our buildings. I mean, Detroit's historic built environment is absolutely character defining to who the city is. It's not all of what the city is, but it helps contribute to the city's identity. And for us to erode that by punching holes in intact neighborhoods and intact blocks doesn't help us move forward in that way. We really need to be kinder to our buildings and better to our buildings.
You write in the Preservation Leadership Forum, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, that many of these properties ravaged by scrappers and arsonists pose serious health and safety threats to the community and bring down neighborhood property values. Strategic demolition, when used wisely, can stabilize neighborhoods and build stronger cities. So how do you go about doing that?
Sure, that's absolutely right. So what we're doing with this citywide survey that we're undertaking currently is actually to help work in conjunction with, you might be familiar with something called Blexting. The Detroit Blight Authority has initiated a citywide, parcel by parcel. Every lot and building in Detroit is being surveyed currently by a large group of people. Our survey is slightly smaller than that, but is complementing what they're doing. Arsonist scrappers absolutely decimate buildings by ripping out piping, by ripping out metal. They are damaging the building to the point that rehabilitation not is beyond repair, but makes it much more challenging. So, by encouraging neighborhoods to stay intact, but also identifying key buildings that are bringing neighborhood values down, that maybe are absolutely have lost integrity, have lost their materials, their historic integrity, could actually strengthen the neighborhoods by being removed. That is absolutely something that we are not opposed to.
Our guest is Emilie Evans on Damian on Design with Damian Farrell, local architect here in Ann Arbor. And Emilie is a preservation specialist with the Michigan Historic Preservation Network and the National Trust for Historic Preservation based in Detroit. Damian?
The 6 neighborhoods that you're going through, how do you characterize them now? What's their current state?
Sure. So these 6 neighborhoods were actually chosen by the Detroit Land Bank Authority as the 6 target areas for this $52 million in hardest hit funds. The character of these neighborhoods is actually rather stable, rather transitional neighborhoods that have a lot of brick. There's not a lot of wood frame there. There's actually a lot of brick. They're in pretty good condition. But they were selected by the land bank because of this idea of strategic demolition, that by strategically demolishing certain buildings within those neighborhoods, they can actually bring the values of those neighborhoods back up. And we would argue, while that is true, identifying buildings that are in good shape, that can help contribute to stabilizing those neighborhoods by staying put, is also extremely valuable to identify.
So these are neighborhoods that really do stand a very good chance with some of the strategy to really maintain their strength and grow.
Absolutely.
And here's an interesting tidbit that I hadn't realized. You're right, this is echoed in Detroit. You're talking about legacy cities that still contain a large number of jobs. Many of these jobs are held by commuters. All right, and here's the fact. In Detroit, 163,500 people work within but live outside the city. And you compare that to only half that number who live and work in the city. Do you think you're going to be able to draw more people to live in the city, those that work there, when you do this kind of work?
I have to believe yes. Quicken Loans has touted that they have brought upwards of, I believe their latest figure was something about 19,000 to 20,000 jobs to the city. We want to encourage those people not just to work in the city, but to live in the city. And we have to do that by creating and stabilizing our wonderful neighborhoods. We need to add that commercial infrastructure that can help support people who don't want to have to drive to the grocery store and drive to the dry cleaners all the time, but maybe want to walk. We have to do that by, so supporting our commercial infrastructure. Obviously, things beyond my purview include mass transportation and things like that, bike lanes, but those are important. But preservation has been at the forefront of creating and stabilizing solid neighborhoods since the beginning, and really that's what we're about. We're about keeping those historic buildings intact, that level of density that people want in a neighborhood. People want to know their neighbors, they want to feel like there's a community around them, and we do that by preserving our historic buildings in these historic neighborhoods.
I've read a number of articles recently of young people who have been attracted by those jobs that you mentioned in Detroit, and also on kind of the artistic and funky type of things that are going on down there now. And they're actually buying these homes because you can get them for nothing. And they're rehabbing them. They're young, they want to do the work themselves. Are you seeing that?
Absolutely, that's everywhere. And that's really exciting. We need to, at various levels, need to further incentivize people and give them the opportunities to gain access to funding, to help support rehab, because these folks are here to stay. They're going to vote, they're going to contribute to the school systems, they're going to pay taxes. And that's really important to bringing the city back. People want to live in interesting buildings. They don't want to live in standardized, boring siding, vinyl sided housing that you can find anywhere. They want to live in the unique character defining buildings that make up our city.